Alright, should be making a video, a draft physics video. So probably renaming the series videos to ShitScience. Who knows? Of the week, of the day, of the hour, doesn't matter. But really, this is just such crap. And it's rewarded on the internet. And yeah, it's just part of the religion. Is, you know, a bunch of preachers who never even read the book, who just tell a bunch of stupid stories that have nothing to do with reality, and convince the morons that this has something to do with reality, when, nah, it just has to do with what they believe, and just finding really superficial ways to defend it. And it's just garbage.
This episode was made possible by generous supporters on Patreon.
Yeah, idiots. Supporting not only first off this stupid dumbing down of science, turning it into some Barney the Dinosaur bullshit. Like you can do science that way, or that you should do science that way. I mean, no, you shouldn't.
Hey crazies, I recently made a video on the origin of light.
You should say, hey stupids, because this isn't just about being crazy. It's just about being too stupid to have any respect first for the scientific process, the method, the idea that you're really talking about reality, and that if you're going to make statements about reality, you ought to be sure you can defend them with something called real evidence, not your exaggerations of the evidence.
I said light was an electromagnetic wave.
Right, a notion. That's all it is. It's a notion. They had to come up with an answer, and so somebody came up with this dopey idea, and no one asked the obvious questions, wave in what? And then when they say fields, well, then fields of what? Magic. Ethery magic. Fun. Fields of fun.
A disturbance in the electromagnetic.
Yeah, a disturbance in the ambiguous, non-described thing. The stuff. A disturbance in the stuff. There, that's physics now. You don't have to be more specific than that.
Field. But how do we actually know light is a wave?
Yeah, well, yes, you know it because you're exaggerators and you're religious people. You've just said, I like waves. Waves are fun. That's it. There's nothing else here. There's just a bias you go in with, and then you confirm your bias with preposterous exaggerations.
What if we're wrong?
Yes, and this has something to do with reality. What if we're wrong? So you take a picture of a groundhog, and that has something to do with why being wrong would really suck. That you're preaching a bunch of crap that isn't true.
Everybody calm down. We discovered light was a wave long before we knew what type of wave.
Yes, no you didn't. You didn't discover anything. Okay, you saw a phenomenon, something moved in the bushes, you said, it's a wonder beast, it's whatever, you know, you just made up something that you decided it was, boogeyman. And yeah, it's just a squirrel, but you couldn't see the squirrel, so you called it the boogeyman. That's all this is. This is just boogie science.
If it was. For the timeline! In 1690, Christian Hawkins
Hawkins? No, it's Huygens. But whatever.
published his treatise on light, where he suggested light was a wave. Then in 1704, Isaac Newton published Optics, where he suggested light was made of tiny little objects.
Right, and he did all of these experiments that you clueless people seem to not understand. I mean, the rings are named after him. Newton's rings. Those are basically an indication that light is distracted from its course and bends, which means it is deflected. That's all it means. What's causing the deflection is the argument.
The debate raged on for almost a century. It wasn't until Thomas Young performed the first double slit experiment.
Right, let's understand. Newton already had done the single hair experiment and done the small aperture experiments, and so he covered all the bases that are really relevant. He covered the surfaces facing out to the surfaces facing in. So he'd already covered all of this crap. So there was nothing remarkable about Young's experiment. It was done with white light, sunlight, and the little bars weren't bars, they were circles indicating something that no one wants to talk about. And let's go a step further and point out that we found out eventually that single photons create the phenomenon. So a lot of theories about wave interference doesn't make too much sense when you start turning a single photon into some sort of two waves. And there's two patterns in the true double slit pattern. So all of that, let's ignore the real science. Let's ignore the real set of facts, is that water waves and light waves, if you're going to call them that, don't create the same pattern. It's a different pattern, that it's made of a completely different kind of on-off, in the sense that the light is either all the photons go to one spot, where in water waves one spot has all of the agitation, the other spot has none of the agitation. So it's a completely different thing, really. But let's ignore that, because that would be being serious about the science. That would taking the subject seriously, and we don't want to do that. We just want to get to our part where we say we prove something when you didn't prove anything.
1801 that we finally proved.
No, yeah, you didn't prove anything. You proved that the light creates a simple pattern, the simplest pattern you can make that you can call a pattern. And now you're going to say you know for certain what always creates that pattern. No, you don't know any of that.
Without a doubt that light is a wave. But what about photons? Shush! So let's get into...
So again, the word photon, okay, again, this is part of the history. We learned things. We learned that Benjamin Franklin associated plus and minus, reversed it, and got it wrong. So there's some things you have to fix over time. And the word photon, okay, was established based on some premise that the idea of what light was a thing, an object. When really you have to kind of understand it as a stream, a ray. It's more complex than that. So it can be made up of individual quanta, and a certain amount of quanta is a certain photon of a certain intensity, but it really has to do with something a little deeper, a little more complex than calling photons single objects, because that's the only way the physics works. I mean, it was just a mistake, and you have to undo the mistake. You have to understand the mistake. You don't even have to undo it. You can still use the word photon to describe a ray of different lengths.
the details of how this double slit thing works. First, we need some kind of wall or screen in the back. It shines wherever light hits it. Now let's say there's a barrier with a couple openings. If light shines on the barrier, it'll pass some of the light and block the rest. But those openings...
Yeah, so we, instead of saying something rational like, no, if we put two giant openings, we'll see no obvious pattern. Because any pattern that's being created by the surfaces is being drowned out by all the light getting through the opening. That would be the sensible thing to say.
Things are way too big to test anything about the light itself. For convenience, we're using visible light. And the size of these waves is on the order of hundreds of nanometers. That's tenths of thousandths of millimeters. So tiny. We don't have to make the openings that small. But any more than 1,000 times bigger, and the light won't spread out. The width and spacing needs to be at least comparable to the wavelength, which is why we call it...
Yeah, so you really don't have to have it that small. You go 1/100th of a millimeter will work, 1/10th of a millimeter will work, so it's just not true what he's saying. It's just not true.
Slits. With openings that thin, something unexpected happens. Instead of two skinny lines on the back wall, we get a pattern of thick, bright lines with dark spaces in between.
Or you get a bunch of circles. Or you get different things if you put different things in. So if your laser beam is smaller than the width of the beam thickness, diameter, is smaller than the dimensions of your slit, you'll actually get circles as your pattern. But let's ignore that fact. Who cares about the facts?
Something we call an interference pattern. Interference is what happens when two waves overlap and combine.
Yes, that's one way you can create patterns in the world. There's other ways you can create patterns. So again, I can make the argument that I can hit something in the water with waves of water, or I could just shoot torpedoes at it. Torpedo every second. Now, both will have the same kind of impact in the sense that a certain amount of energy will come at a certain period of time. But the two things aren't comparable as, oh, they're both waves. No, they're not both waves.
Light is a wave in the electromagnetic field.
That's what you're saying this video is attempting to prove. You can't use your proof. The thing you're attempting to show has been proven by just saying it. You have to actually have the evidence for it.
But what about photons? I said shush! Light is a wave in the electromagnetic field.
Again, says you, okay? Based on what theory besides somebody says so and then you all agreed to say so, but you have no preponderance of evidence, you have no mountains of evidence, you have nothing really as evidence except your will to say it's a little bit like it. Again, let's understand that before the single photon experiment, they thought these were individual photons interfering with individual photons, different photons. And then when they found out, oh, single photons do this, they had to come up with some other new theory to figure out, well, why is it doing that? And then they used this Huygens thing, but they only apply it in one experiment, because in one experiment it'll create two waves and the other experiment it won't. But wait a minute. It's inverted because, frankly, there's absolutely no reason in a single slit that two waves would be created. Because there's not two slits to create the two waves. So here they have two different mechanisms. Completely different, apparently. I mean, no Huygens in the double slit, Huygens in the single slit. There's no consistency here. This isn't good evidence of anything.
But there's only one electromagnetic field. It can only respond to the
again, does that make any sense? There's only one electromagnetic field. So, don't you say right to yourself, no, you really mean there's two fields, right? The magnetic field and the electric field. You don't really mean the two fields are one field, do you?
sum of everything that's happening to it. That's what we call superposition. Superposition.
So this is not more messing up a simple concept. Superposition really just has to do with things not interacting. So when they use the word superposition in gravitational models, they're basically saying the waves don't interfere with each other. The gravity doesn't affect the gravity. Okay, and it's not until the gravity hits, you add up exactly the influence of each individual object, and its influence doesn't get mixed with any other influence. And so you just figure out what the individual influences are and add them up. That's superposition. Almost by definition, wave interference is essentially saying, no, there is no superposition. The field itself interacts and messes up does the addition before the thing actually gets to another thing. So it's breaking language again. So that's another thing they rely on, is the fact that you don't think words should have standard definitions.
Is when two or more things cause a net response that's just the sum of the responses that would have been caused by each thing individually.
That's right. So the two things don't interfere with each other. You just add up the individual actions and come up with a result, but the actions don't change before they get to you. You can't change the gravity the moon's creating by putting another moon in space. Putting another moon there won't undo the moon. It won't change the effect of the moon.
It happens all the time with waves. If you've got two waves like this.
So it really doesn't, even in waves, because what would happen theoretically is if the two waves were exactly out of phase, there would be absolutely nothing happening. And we know you can't destroy energy, so we know nothing's not a possibility. So this is crap.
The sum of the two looks like this. When peaks line up with peaks, we call it constructive interference, because it builds up an even bigger wave, which means brighter light. When peaks line up with troughs, we call it destructive interference, because the waves cancel out, which means no.
Yes, and you could do the same thing with bullets or anything else, as if you could overlap when you're shooting two guns, so you shoot them exactly in phase, then you'll have two bullets hitting you at the same time. And then if you change the phase and they're out of phase, well, then you're going to have bullet, 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 and you'll still have empty spaces between them.
Light. If the waves cancel, where does the energy go? It just goes somewhere else in the...
Yeah, it just goes somewhere else in the field. Okay, so that's their scientific answer. So they're sure about all this crap, yet they can't answer any of these questions. How exactly does it go somewhere else? Because that's not what it does in water waves. The energy just it doesn't go somewhere else. All the energy goes to the constructive thing, and no energy exists where the destructive is happening, because that energy has been annihilated, okay, by reflections, and you can explain where it goes, but there's no explanation in this field argument about where the energy goes to. Does it go to the left or does it go to the right? What's your explanation? Where does the energy go?
Field. The wave doesn't cancel everywhere. Anyway, constructive and destructive interference aren't the only two options.
So this was a bizarre statement in the sense that he's saying there's no other options.
There are many gradual levels of brightness in between, depending on how the...
That's an interference, okay? The gradual stuff in between is still interference. You're just saying that this is 75% up and this is only 25% down, so you're still 50% up. Kind of bullshit. It's still interference.
Waves meet each other. With our double slit, we basically have two independent sources of light.
So let's understand that this just totally ignores what is the real evidence, which is light doesn't create a smooth gradual pattern of on, off, on, off, on, off. It does in fact create shapes. If you do multi-slit experiments, you'll get really distinct, round, the same shape as the laser beam. You'll get images projected. So this just ignores all the facts that exist, just pretends those facts don't exist. I don't have to account for them. I don't have to talk about them. I don't have to accept their reality. So they have this completely made-up notion that the pattern in photons, that is light, visible light, is the same as the pattern in electrons, when if you look at the two patterns, you'll see they're not the same. The one with light photons has two patterns, an envelope. Lots of things it has that the other pattern doesn't have.
They look like this from behind. Because those slits are narrow...
Certainly water waves don't have. So this simplistic explanation, again, it's just a simplistic seems like thing. Oh, it's a little bit similar in the double slit. It's a little similar. It's not all similar in the single slit, and it's not all similar in the multi-slit, and it's a little similar in the double slit, and therefore we know light is a wave. We've proven it. That's the word he used, proven. They have proven nothing.
The light from each slit will spread.
Except that they are lousy scientists and stupid.
Out. If each slit is sending out its own light waves, those waves are going to overlap and interfere with each other.
Yes, and how is the slit sending out its own light wave? So again, we know the experiment's done with a single photon produces the result. So how does each slit producing photons out of photons? How are you making more photons out of a single photon? So we know the word photon doesn't mean too much in this conversation, but don't pretend that you're not... Go ahead and say what you're really saying, is that somehow one photon goes in, somehow it turns into two things. Those two things interfere with themselves. So it's not the photon interfering. So just quit lying about what's going on.
In the middle of the wall, the waves have to travel the same distance. That makes their...
Alright, so then this is just the basic geometry argument. I mean, this isn't part of anything called a proof.
Peaks meet up, and we see a bright line. We'll label that 0. Farther along the wall, we'll find a place where peaks meet up with troughs. That's the first dark line. So, depending on how far each of these waves has to travel compared to the other, we get bright lines or dark lines.
And it's just a phase argument. So it's just how much the light's in phase or out of phase. And that's it. And yet you can't say it that simply.
The next bright line is where the light from one slit has to travel one wavelength farther than the light from the other slit. We'll label that 1 because the difference in distance is 1 wavelength. There's another bright line at 2 wavelengths.
Right, so all you're seeing there is the numbers, right? So 0, 1, 2, and all they do is multiply that number, okay, to times a standard angle, sine theta. So all this really is saying is that there's a general angle, depending on how variant your light is. So let's say you had a really, really precise laser that was only one frequency. Maybe these bars would be very, very small, very sharp. Because you wouldn't have any gradations in the pattern because the frequency would be so narrow. And so even that argument is ignored. And all this is really saying is there's an angle. You multiply the angle times 1, times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5. The same angle. It's just an angle change.
Another at 3 wavelengths, and so on. Quick side note though. You get the best results with a single color of light.
And we know that this is what happens when light diffracts into a substance. So it bends at a standard angle, depending on the substance. The light bends at a standard angle. And there's no reason to think of it as a wave dynamic or an interference pattern because the light deflects at a standard angle. And all you're doing is instead of going through a surface, you're just going along a surface in the double slit experiment. So again, I just keep arguing that it's kind of obvious when you look at this device, the slits. You can look at it 2 ways. You can look at it as being, oh, it's some sort of confinement, so it's a slit. But we know that a single impediment does the same thing. And so what does a single impediment? Okay, it doesn't have an opening, can't call it a slit, can't think about it as a confinement. It's not like it's a Heisenberg thing. It's not confining the space and you're not doing a measurement and all this kind of arguments they make. Why does this single impediment do the same damn thing? Because it's about a surface. So these experiments should have been called what they are, surface-oriented experiments. And so it should be the double surface for the single slit or the single impediment or the quadruple surface experiment. But that's how it should have been named. Because it's about surfaces.
The equation for where to find the lines is wavelength dependent.
Yes, it's wavelength dependent, and it's also the width of the slit dependent. So let's not pretend that there isn't other things it's dependent on, because it's clearly dependent on how wide the slit is also, or how far the surfaces are from each other.
So if you try this with white light, the pattern is harder to make out.
It's pretty obvious. Was that hard to make out? No. And that's how Young did the experiment. So again, reality check somebody, please.
End of side note. How many bright lines are there? That depends on the slit width and spacing.
And again, this is completely undemonstrated by any experiment I've ever seen conducted. So I haven't seen any experiment where they put a photographic plate on either side of the 2 slits. So you have your slits here and you put a plate going this way so you can catch the real peripheral light. Who's ever done the experiment? Has anyone ever done it? No.
We can only get bright lines up to 90 degrees in either direction.
They just made that part up. Okay, there's no experimental evidence demonstrating that you get light at 89 degrees or 87 degrees or 97 degrees or 96 degrees or any of those peripheral high degrees. No evidence of it. But their theory is dependent on it being there. It really should be there because there should be, if you wait long enough, there should be photons going there. Well, why don't they prove it with an experiment? Why are they just saying it as if they did prove it? They never proved it. They never demonstrated it. That's, again, they know something, they say they've proven something, yet they haven't done the experiments to prove it.
Direction. Eventually, we run out of room. As I mentioned before, though, there aren't just bright lines and dark lines. There's a gradual transition in brightness from one to the other.
Right, and that graduation is very different in the electron experiment compared to the visible photon experiment. And the gradation is completely distortable based on what shape the light has that you put into the slits. Why should the shape of the light be relevant? It shouldn't be if it's waves interfering.
If you graph out the predicted intensities across the wall, they match the experiment perfectly.
So again, just more nonsense. If it's a double slit, then see, you have these extra dead spots. You see those extra dead spots? You didn't even mention those. What's that about there, fella? What's that? And this over here, what's that? Where's that coming from? That's not in your formula, I'm afraid. No. So he says it matches perfectly, yet it doesn't match perfectly.
Science at its finest.
No, that's what he says. Science at its finest. They match perfectly. Doesn't match perfectly. They haven't done the experiments. Just crap. They just made up this shit. So how is this not just religion? Just make up the facts. Just somebody said so. Somebody said there's an electromagnetic field of some kind. And now you've decided, well, that's your God. And you're just going to come up with silly rationalizations to defend that silly notion.
What happens if we move the wall closer or farther away?
Well, any dumbass could figure that out. But again, if you pointed out the fact that, well, what is the surface you're projecting the light on doing for you? Well, it's magnifying the effect so you can see it. Because you put the surface really, really close, it's tiny, and you can't see it. So you need to have some distance so you can actually resolve the effect.
It'll change the size of the pattern, but not its shape. The wave interference is happening all throughout the space between the slits in the wall. If you could actually see...
Well, theoretically it's not. Theoretically at 1 millimeter, or the distance between the two slits total, the maximum distance, which should be something like a 0.5 millimeter anyway. At less than that distance, the wave interference wouldn't have time to form.
The electromagnetic field, the places you'd find dark lines would be pretty obvious. But what about photons? Photons are waves too, okay?
No, it's not okay. It's not okay for you to just keep saying it when you haven't demonstrated with anything called a really substantial amount of evidence. If physics was really about a trial and it was really about something at stake, except just your silly integrity, which you don't have any fear of your integrity being at stake because everybody's preaching what you're preaching, so you don't have any fear of being outed. But it's like the religious people, they didn't have any fear for a long time because the dumb masses bought this bullshit. But then science showed up and showed evolution and this and that, and then they started getting paranoid and they became pretty aggressive in defending their faith.
Seriously, their energy is measured indirectly through their frequency.
So again, the Planck's constant is just nonsense. Again, the frequency doesn't measure the energy of the quanta. The quanta is what it has. And the way you measure its energy is just measuring how much of the stuff, how many little bullets are traveling. And obviously, if I shoot bullets really fast, more bullets per second will hit a target, more energy. But it's only incidental to the fact that I've reduced the distance between the bullets, therefore more bullets in a volume. But it doesn't change the nature of the photon. There's no high frequency photon versus low frequency photon in the sense the bullets don't change. It's just how many bullets. I mean, that's how far off they are.
Objects don't have frequency. Waves do. When you do the same double slit experiment with individual photons...
when he says objects don't have frequency, right, he's saying bullets don't have a frequency, the individual bullet. But clearly, how the bullets are arranged will decide its frequency. So again, making something have a frequency without calling it an object. Even in water waves, the actual bullets, the actual quanta of water atoms, they don't individually have any frequency, but clearly collectively they create one. So again, it's just playing with words, distorting perception, narrowing focuses to try to make it look right when it's not right. The statement in itself is wrong to say objects don't. Well, yes, I mean, no object is an object till you get to the elemental level. So clearly everything is a mixture of objects. And yes, if I can have many bullets, then I can have lots of frequency.
And you've got a screen that can keep a record of when light hits it? The same interference pattern builds up over time.
So he didn't even make it clear that he was talking about sending single photons through this double slit, and somehow the single photon creates two different field perturbations that interfere with each other, but in the end it only goes to one place. So it does a bunch of wave interfering, and yet the energy for all that interference, all the different other locations that the force was going to, or the perturbation was going to, is somehow retracted from ever having existed. It has no impact in the universe, and the only thing that has an impact is where the photon lands. I mean, it's just shit science. It's just garbage. It doesn't make any sense at all.
No matter how you look at it, light is a wave.
No, you can look at it rationally and just realize the universe isn't made out of waves. There's no waves between the sun and the moon and the stars and all this stuff. What there is a bunch of stuff banging into each other, and there's a force based on mass in terms of gravitational force. But other than that, you don't have any of this crap going on. There's no frickin' necessity to turn everything into a wave at all. And if you just start with the idea that it's momentum going from point A to point B, and that's what photons do, they transfer momentum from one place to another place, and they move electrons with that momentum. That's the physical fact, and you don't need a wave to do that. You can do that with a frickin' rock.
We know that because it can interfere with itself. And that interference...
So again, interfere with itself. There's no water waves interfering with themselves.
Produces a pattern on a screen. Got any questions about diffraction or interference? Please ask in the comments.
Why? Can I ask a question? I mean, do you really think Newton would be proud? Did you think anybody who takes science seriously would be proud of this superficial coverage of a subject that's rather important to the foundations of understanding the physical universe, and that you're basically aggressively asserting a fact that you've proven something, you've demonstrated with huge amounts of evidence that you can be confident this theory is correct, and yet you have nothing to base this on. And if you used a little bit of imagination, you can come up with lots of other explanations for why there's a pattern.
If you were hoping for more about photons, don't worry. I'll be going into more detail on that next time.
Yeah, no, you liar. You will not ever pay attention to the actual physical evidence, and you'll make up a bunch of fake stuff that never took place. That's what can be guaranteed, because your argument is stupid, it's illogical, the whole thing is nonsense, and all you're doing is rationalizing a stupid model.
Thanks for liking and sharing this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with us. Hit that notification bell if you're really into what we do here. And until next time, remember, it's okay.
We do here. Him and his whole group of whatever. Marketing. Bullshit. Shit science. This fucking shit. Anyway, let's see what it says here. We might not have unified electrodynamics till 1865. He didn't unify anything. Hold on a second. Okay, should be back. Better check. Looks like it. So 1865, so he's talking about Maxwell, which again was just combining a bunch of observed facts. And turning them into a more efficient formula. But the basis of it still already contained what they assumptions that were already built in, which were made-up constants, the permeability of space and the permeability of space, whatever. Anyway, which added up to the speed of light, which, yes, that's a good thing to figure out, is all the forces are moving the same speed, but their conclusion was to turn all the forces into waves rather than to think, well, maybe light is just a form of gravity, and they never thought of gravity as having any wave properties. Anyway, but we've known light was a wave since the original double slit experiment. So again, the original double slit experiment, when Newton had already done the surface experiments, and that's how it's really relevant. And to understanding it as a surface phenomenon seems to me really bad of physics that they never thought of it that way. I mean, they had me even confused, keep thinking about slits and openings, and instead of thinking about, well, this isn't about openings, it's about surfaces, and the single impediment demonstrates it's about surfaces. Let's talk about diffraction and wave interference. So again, just, the word diffraction would be interesting. In the sense that they turned that word, which was a word kind of a synonym of deflection, diffraction, and now turned that into a wave phenomenon word. But anyway.
To be a little crazy.
Yeah.
The future...
Again, the synonym in this case is stupid. Just be ignorant. Be a liar. Okay? Just make up evidence. Make up experiments that never were done, They don't care about the truth and facts, and that the facts should really point hard to something, not, in some, like I said, just a tiny, tiny bit of similarity, and lots of reason not to believe. Lots of counter evidence, okay? The fact that water and light don't do anything similar with a single slit, and the fact that multi-slits don't do anything that can be justified as wave interference because they're actual images of the object. But no, let's just ignore those facts.
Comment comes from A. Dosar, who asked, if wavelength can vary from medium to medium, wouldn't it be more accurate to define color with frequency? On a scale like ours, yes, we have to define color with frequency for that exact reason. But on a microscopic level, light is never really inside a material. Anyway, thanks for...
It's another nonsense, right? Light's never inside a material. I mean, obviously, if it's a field perturbation, yes, it would be. But rationally, yes, it's obviously inside the material. It travels from one end of the material to the other end of the material. What form it's in, that's the question. It's not traveling as a free photon in the sense that it's force, and force can be manifested as magnetism and electricity and gravity. But anyway, just so bad. Disgusting that people reward this crap. I mean, this is crap science. No discipline. No, don't open your mouth till you're sure. None of that. Fuck that. Just terrible that this is the standard for okay. It's okay to do this. It's just not. It's not okay. It shouldn't be okay. That's the point. It shouldn't be okay. Even people who believe that photons are waves shouldn't think this kind of propaganda is the way to go. That's the honorable, fair fight kind of way to talk about physics. Just pretend all the evidence against this stupid theory doesn't exist. So anyway, until next time.